All right, we're going to go ahead and get started here, Greg. Kind of a little bit different topic than we typically discuss. I mean, we're going to frame it in how we do things, but this was actually inspired by an article. This is more of like a philosophical discussion about sort of right and wrong and where we get our, ethical judgments from. But I found it interesting because for a number of reasons, and I'll put the link up because the name of the article is called "Does One Emotion Rule All Our Ethical Judgments?" So whether you want to take it from an ethical judgment and a philosophical standpoint, or as we do with the behavior and what you actually do, doesn't really matter. I think what I was interested in about it is too is it once again kind of ties everything back to a very primal instincts, very unconscious way of thinking, that is tied directly to survival, which is what is sort of the basis of what we do, right? We tie things back to the unconscious brain, how it's tied to survival, and then why sort of like how your behavior manifests out of that, right? And in a sense, and so that's given things that are happening in the environment, perceived threats, what you're thinking, what your life experiences. There's a lot that plays into it, but this was sort of an interesting one to start from. So, Greg, I think I'll kind of give a recap and go over my
Yeah.
thoughts initially, and then to get everyone up to speed on kind of what we're talking about. And then I'll have the link in there. You can go back and read it, but we'll cover a lot of it in here today. So, like I said, this came from, I believe, in the New Yorker, right? Does one emotion rule all our ethical judgments? And so Elizabeth Colbert's article in the New Yorker centers on research from moral psychologist Kirk Gray, who proposes that our strongest moral convictions all revolve around one key emotion, the fear of harm. So Colbert begins by telling the story of Raymond Dart's 1924 discovery of the Tong child, an ancient human ancestor in South Africa, which upended the notion that our earliest forebears were fearless predators. Instead, the evidence suggests they were often prey. So, this evolutionary history, Gray argues, may explain why we're so quick to see threats and feel outrage in the modern world. After millions of years of trying to avoid becoming dinner, humans developed a hypersensitivity to harm. So, like an innate hypervigilance, if you will.
Right.
So Colbert then contrasts Gray's view with what's called moral foundations theory, most famously associated with Jonathan Haidt. And Haidt's approach claims people have multiple modules like loyalty, fairness, and sanctity, which shape their moral judgments. But Gray counters that one overarching concern, perceived harm, drives almost everything. Even in scenarios that seem victimless, most people instinctively suspect that someone is getting hurt, even if they can't say exactly how. Now, according to Gray, that's because we're wired to assume harm lies beneath any moral transgression. So this is kind of where it kind of interest and goes back to really this evolutionary way of looking at it. But the article also examines why societies are so divided on issues like abortion or immigration. Both sides often invoke vulnerable victims, but focus on different ones. So, for example, the fetus versus the woman, or local citizens versus immigrant children. And Colbert notes that when people try to sway others with facts, it usually fails. But vivid harm based stories work far better at engaging emotions. Finally, she raises the question of whether a primal instinct designed to confront saber-toothed tigers can handle today's complex threats like artificial intelligence or political discourse. In the end, fear of harm emerges as a possible unifying explanation for moral outrage, yet it also points to a deep-rooted challenge, our instinctive tendency to see and fight about danger that's seemingly everywhere. Before we jump into the discussion, discuss some of the points from the article, there are a couple things that I would kind of want to start off with. So first, from a linguistic perspective, when the term threat or threatened is typically, or when it's used, it typically someone perceives or feels that something is a threat. And this subjective aspect of the perception is important to understand because there's no difference between your brain. Meaning, if you feel that something is a threat to your safety or survival, then for all intents and purposes, it is a threat and you will behave accordingly, regardless of whether or not it's true. It's true to you, and that's all that matters to your brain. Secondly, as a behaviorist, I focus on what people actually do rather than why they say they do it. Your unconscious mind makes the majority of your decisions for you, and so it's not always clear why we make certain decisions or arrive at various conclusions, or at least it's not as clear as we think it is. This is also why you'll hear me refer to you and your brain as sort of two separate entities. Physiologically, right? Strong and complex relationship between your conscious mind and your unconscious one, and they work together in a manner that we kind of still don't fully comprehend. But for the purpose of training, education, and discussion, I kind of think it's important to distinguish between the two because it helps delineate between what you can and cannot control. And then I had a note in there to insert some joke about stoicism, but I apparently never went back and thought of one. But I'll let you do that. But
Well,
that's sort of the
a Stoic wouldn't allow it. You know what I'm
yeah.
saying?
But
Dan,
no,
your humorous
but
attempt.
yeah, that's sort of just the introduction to everything from the
Yeah.
article and how we approach things. I just want to like kind of delineate a few things up front, and then there's a lot we can get into. So before I go on or anything, Greg, I want to kind of throw to you as well to get
No,
started.
that's great. And so, Brian, you did such a great job of framing the discussion. So I'd like to just throw in a couple of definitions so we can all talk about it, meaning everybody at home and us as well. So first, cautionary tale. I remember being called out by a Marine gunny, and he came up right in the middle of class and he said, "Unconscious means you're asleep," and it was like, okay, uh, Brian, some people you're not going to be able to spar with no matter where you are or what the
Yeah,
argument is or how intellectual it may seem. So that's the first one. So a couple quick things. So definition of moral psychology. Moral psychologists put aside questions of how people should make moral judgments to examine how people do make moral judgments. Important distinction.
important distinction.
Definition of moral foundations theory. There's two. So there's the moral foundation theory and then the moral foundations theory. So in other words, one card, one ring to rule them all, okay, or many cards, many examples, the mental structure, the modules, and people reach ethical decisions on the basis of either a mental structure or a series of mental models that have been pre-wired into our brains. And that involves feelings like being vulnerable, being empathetic, a resentment of cheaters, a respect for an authority figure. All of those things that we call file folders that we know
Yeah.
that people have, right? But this again is somebody else's attempt to categorize something in
Yep.
a way that works for them. Do you get what I'm
Yes.
saying? Oh, we don't call that a snow cone. Here we call that an ice dish, right?
Yeah.
Then we've got a definition of bias. So a bias merely your tendency to respond one way compared to another when you're making any number of life choices. I prefer a red blanket. Brian is blue. I prefer a sports shoe. Brian's more of a ballerina. I like salads over fast food. Those biases are going to consciously and unconsciously impact all of our choices. The door we go in, when we start our car, whether the radio's on or off. Those are just things we do. So a bias isn't a bad thing. It's how we approach things because of historical precedent, because of ease of movement, because of any number of things. So what's an implicit bias? And this is where we got to jump on it just for a second.
Yeah.
Implicit biases have also been called implicit prejudices or attitudes or negative attitudes. You got to remember, if it's implicit, it's one bias that you're not consciously aware of.
Yeah.
So it means that you choose against a specific social group. Well, our consigliere, Sean, sent me a very interesting video of a dog herding ducks. And a number of the ducks were white and a number of the ducks were black. Now, this has nothing to do with race. What it has to do with is self-preservation. So when the dog was trying to cut the ducks hid with other ducks that looked like them. So
Right.
a white duck would clearly stand out in a group of black ducks and vice versa. So we have to understand sometimes an implicit bias is beyond our control, Brian, and we're there because we don't understand what it had to do with our upbringing. So we don't know 3,000 years ago what it was and the reason we turned the doorknob to the right or to the left. And we
Right.
make up things to say
Yes.
that. So we come into the church and we touch the holy water that's on the right. We're not sure that water was there because it was a fire risk and before it was used to,
Yeah.
douse the candles. You understand what I'm saying? So what happens there, and you brought up something I just took a note on, when you're talking about ethical or behavioral. So both of us are behaviorists, and that's not an insult because philosophically, when we think about threats, we think about an existential threat. And
Yes.
that means you're questioning your life choices, even though you're not in danger, or you might not be in danger,
Well,
but you're
yeah.
projecting a potential danger. Do you see what I'm
Yeah.
trying to say? And what I mean by that is that's a very selfish fear of harm to me. And this is where I want to deep dive just for a second. When Dart was writing about the predatory transition from ape to man, it
Yeah.
was profound. It was
Yeah.
very influential at the time. And then he figured out, wait a minute, with more study, his theory was wrong. So
Yep.
as a good scientist, you got to update. You got to change your theory when new science comes in, right? The Tong child changed that. So instead of being that apex predator, guess what? He was running for his life most of his life, and he ended up getting eaten. So Gray in Outraged, available for Pantheon, folks, if you want to look up the book. Gray argues that most of the problems of contemporary society can be traced to that being prey. That's simple. That's something that we love because
Yeah.
that means that all our thoughts and feelings arise from that mental model that was evolved eons ago and that was hardwired for our survival. And we know that. We know that we're much more likely to choose survival oriented thinking and predicting anarchy and anxiety rather than saying everything's fine, having the everything's okay alarm going up. But Gray also says harm is the master key of morality. And this is where he starts going off because he
Yeah.
says our ethical judgments are governed not by these modules, but by one overriding emotion, and that this fear emotion is making us hypersensitive. Well, what he's accounting for again is a very, in my opinion only, is a
Yeah.
very selfish view. What he's saying is these things that I fear, whether they truly cause harm or not, are enough for me to go off and be who I am.
Yes.
And see, you can't do that because the existential threat to a scientist means that a living, non-living, future event that threatens something else, and it's realistic. Like we don't understand if a meteor is ever going to knock us out of orbit. We don't understand if global
Right.
warming is going to change stuff and trigger a nuclear winter. Do you see what I'm trying to say, Brian?
Yeah.
So one is an irrational fear, and humans don't do irrational fears unless they have some other external schema pressing on them. That's just my opinion.
No, and that's this is kind of the part I want to get into because when there we have such a strong evolutionary sort of advantage by doing that, being
Yep.
fearful of things, right? And so then you can make the, well, that's Plato's allegory of the cave, that's everything. It's like, okay, I'm going to sit back here where it's warm and I know what's going on. I'm not going to venture out because a lot of people that venture out die, but occasionally they do really well and they
Yep.
thrive, not only thrive but become leaders of some new thing or create something that never existed before. So there's always that play, and it's this fear. And when you get into how this is why too, because you're talking about existential threat. Well, an existential threat is literally something that would threaten your existence. But
Yep.
now if you get stuff, and this is why, because this was all originally talking about these, I was about writing about politics and politicians, which didn't even matter to me. It was just the interest of their underlying theories, right? Because it's funny because even in their writing, I found it a little bit ironic because it's kind of like, wait a minute, you're saying all these things that this person's bad, but you're kind of
Yep.
just you're actually helping prove your theory here, but you're kind of getting it wrong in how it's getting laid out
Exactly.
here. And
Exactly.
and and what I look at it is because that's a subjective measurement of something that's an existential threat, like, well, I that's to a human being, that could be anything. What's a threat to you is nothing to me. What's a huge threat to me is nothing to you. I mean, literally, one person eats a peanut butter, they'll die. Like that's an existential threat to them,
Yep.
where everyone else is fine eating it, right? But what I'm saying is that it plays with so emotion based too, especially when there's all of these seemingly things that are very complex that I don't fully understand coming at me. Well, that's fucking scary for my little pea brain. You know what I mean? It
Yep.
really is. So I always default to that fear. And so what they're trying to say is like, okay, that's sort of like where morality in a sense comes from.
Yeah.
And like I went like, I see what you're doing here. I see how you're connecting the dots. But I think you're taking something that's complex, you're
Yep.
addressing the complexity of it and how long this has happened, but then you're kind of providing too simple of an answer for me. You know what I'm saying?
Yep.
It's like you're you're
Yep.
you're you're oversimplifying this part of it. So there's the things that I found interesting, obviously, because we talk about it, and like the article talks about what they call like fear wiring and harm detection,
Yep. Yep.
and that, but that's that's pattern recognition, right? That's why we're primed for that kind of stuff.
Precisely.
And so this whole evolutionary backdrop is like, yeah, you're dead on that this is where these things come from. So the recognition of how these things fall in, like I'm making those unconscious choices of what's scary and what isn't, especially now, like, because
Right.
this was written about politics. Well, the saying used to be like all politics are local, right? Like if you're in the political world, like kind of like you still got to get out there and do this and you still
Yep.
got, which is technically true, right? You still got to get people to vote and all those things. But what's changed because of the speed of communication, how connected everyone is like now everything is a national story and everything has to do with the United States. And it's like, how many of these actually affect you in your backyard today, like
Yep.
in your family, in your
But
life?
if I tell you it does, and if I put my thumb on the scale, and if I make a
Yes.
dark cloud and lightning, then all of a sudden it does, Brian. And that's what I don't think is fair here. And I mean, you bring
What
up
do you
a
mean
great
not
point.
like
So
what do
so
you mean
so
by
let me
like
explain that.
yeah,
Let me
yeah, yeah.
explain that. Okay. So horses, elk, and elephants were once vampires. And
Okay.
they're
Good.
vampires
This ought to be good.
that changed how we write stories and scare children and make movies. Okay, so male horses have fangs, known as canine teeth, and all male horses have 4 canine teeth, 2 on the top and 2 on the bottom. And maybe a quarter or less of female horses have some canine teeth, but they're usually small, they're benign. So historically, they were used for fighting. Horses fought other horses. They didn't and don't help the horse chew. These canine teeth start with a mature horse, 4 to 6 years of age. Elk, prehistoric elk and past elk once had tusks. And even now, when you hunt elk, their modern canine teeth are remnants of those tusks, and we call them ivories, or as Jaeger would call them, whistlers. Ancient elk had the tusks for defense and to establish dominance, much like antlers established dominance
Yeah.
in the tribe. So, a scientific study, the actual research that's conducted to answer a question, if I pick and fucking choose from that, what I can
Yeah.
do is come up with a story. Well, the only reason a horse would have canine and the only reason an elk and a gosh damn elephant would have them is because they sucked the blood of the other animals and that led to a downfall or whatever else. Brian, it's unscientific to the point that it's non-scientific. And this is what I mean. So he wrote Outraged, and here's his own quote. When I wrote Outraged, it was written at a time of extreme political polarization, and it's coming out just days before the polarizer in chief, Donald Trump, is set to be inaugurated. Okay, Brian, so that's what I'm
A
talking
loaded
about. Listen,
statement. Like
exactly. I do not care. We work at the behest of the government, and when we do, the commander in chief
yeah,
is our
it's
boss.
yeah, doesn't
It's just simple. Okay,
yeah.
and so the idea is that when you start saying that, listen, I know he's in power, but we got to do everything that we can to fight against him. What you're doing is fighting against your fellow Americans. You're fighting against our livelihood, whoever's in power. So there was no good demeaning and bashing Biden for not showing up because he was, in mid Alzheimer's or whatever it was. But it also wasn't good for anybody to hide that. You see what I'm trying to say? Transparency and knowledge. Science is one of those things that when we shine a light on it, it still exists. It's not smoke and mirrors, and it's not a parlor trick. So what Gray's done here is you bring up some incredible arguments, but then what he does is he throws all of these other politics-based
Yeah.
conjecture in with a solid argument, and that's the only reason I just called horseshit when I started deep diving Outrage.
Well, and this is in general why I don't and I know you don't either, but like it's really like I don't have those philosophical discussions a lot because it's kind of like you get they're so general that you can throw anything you want in there.
Yep.
And then I've never walked away from one of those conversations going, wow, that's enlightening. It's always like that was a waste of time. Now, unless I will say this, there are like in some roles, right? So I look at like there's a lot of like military leaders, and you're talking about different philosophical ways of approaching things. I actually understand it a little bit more in that context, obviously
Yeah.
being from the military, but also because they have they're dealing at nation state level with the geopolitics of a country, with changing administrations, changing public. They have a mission to do. And a
Yep.
lot of times it's not clear, and they're always trying to figure out what the next thing coming is. And so, in order to do that, you can't make up random shit and go, well, I think it's going to be the Klingons and they're going to come out of here. Like, no, like
Yep.
you have to base it on something. However, you're in uncharted waters in a sense, going, well, we don't know what's going to happen or what the next step is. Maybe the strategic initiative here isn't very clear. So you have to
Exactly.
fall back on something. So they'll have these moral discussions on what the values are and the ethics, because without that and a commander's intent, like you're kind of you're screwed. But a lot of
Yep.
places are just having these like kind of philosophical things, and it's like, well, you have to frame it around something. And if you're going to frame it around something, then you have to include everything in there, and then you have to look at those laws or those things that your the evolutionary things that we know haven't changed or don't change very quickly, and
Yep.
go, this is, and you have to look at that as the constant. You can't then dig down into these different weeds of what's happening today, because it's so micro, it might be a blip on the radar, and in 10 years, like, no one's even, it's not even a thing,
Agreed.
because there's been some either major thing, or we've realized, hey, wait a minute. That's why we'd always make the joke, like, this was, the third presidential election in my lifetime. That was the most important election in the history of the country.
In
Like,
the history of the United States.
statistically, that's not even fucking
Right.
possible. Like
Right.
you're telling me I was alive for the three most important ones out of our almost nearing 300 years of
Come
existence for
on.
this nation. Like, that's highly unlikely, based on,
Back
how
to the
about
selfishness.
Civil War, where 600,000 Americans were killed fighting each other. Like, maybe
No,
that
it's
one was slightly more important.
so I'm not bashing Gray, because Gray brings up some good
Yeah,
points, and we'll
great
discuss his
points.
good points.
Yeah,
But I will tell you this: a selfish fear helps no one. So, for example, I was in you know me, I'm always going toe to toe with somebody somewhere, and I'm in City Market, and somebody was just talking smack about immigration. And first of all, there's laws. So we live in a country of laws. So read immigration law is very specific. There's different rules that apply to immigration and protecting your borders than other laws. And if you're not educated on them, don't go spouting off on them. As a matter of fact, if you take a look at the base of the Statue of Liberty, there's a give us
yeah,
your,
yeah,
okay,
yeah, yeah. And
great
Lazarus.
speech
Yeah.
that's down there. Yeah. Okay. But you know what was on Ellis Island? People stopping you and
Yeah,
asking you for
and
ID and who you were from and everything, and people
documenting
are getting
everything.
sent
Yeah,
back out. So
yeah.
so we forget
Well,
certain parts of our own history,
we do
and we choose the ones that suit
that.
us better than
that
others.
that's and that's my that's the interesting part to me about those conversations, because you even said it. You said, selfish fear. Well,
Mm-hmm.
technically, most fear is selfish, because it
Yep.
affects me, which affects which affects
Yep.
the society, right? We are thinking that way in a sense of survival of ourselves in order to survive the species. So that's
Yep.
the inherent evolutionary trait in everyone. And then what gets really subjective is what then is an existential threat, or what's a fear, because if I can link a few points together and see, well, if this occurs, then it's going to be
Yep.
chaos, and it's like, oh my god, it really is. And that's where that storytelling comes in. And this, what they even brought up, and how easy it is to polarize people, even
Agreed.
though we're technically wired in a sense in the opposite direction, where we want to get along in order to make things, but we do need to have some common threat or enemy. And since that's not happening in our environment, we're still hyper vigilant in a sense to go, well, but
Yep.
it's in my DNA that there are threats out there, because there are. It's just
Of course.
the development of the world has changed significantly, exponentially faster than the operating system we're working on. And
Precisely.
so
So
I think, but also too, to that, like, every generation has had this is more than humans are supposed to know or understand, or this is too
yep.
much, or, like, you know what I'm saying? And everyone keeps going
Yep.
back to this. Well, back then we didn't have these problems. Like, yeah, back then
You
Plato was
had
bitching about
different
young Greek kids
exactly.
fucking who didn't know
It
their
was the
history.
same problems, and there
But
was
but
graffiti everywhere, and
but
crime,
but
and the price of eggs was the most on people's mind. You're right.
and this is the important part to remember, because I remember even, like, when we had Dr. Leah DeBello on a while
Yep.
back, like, who's great. She's like, no, it's called the adaptive unconscious for a reason. And I was like,
Yes.
yeah, that's right. It can adapt very quickly.
Yep.
Like, your unconscious brain is constantly adapting, and it's setting a new baseline and it's changing. That's why when like all this something comes out and goes, oh my God, this is horrible for people, or oh my God, this is really good for people. It's like, dude, it's only been a few years. Like we don't
Exactly.
we don't know.
We still don't know. We don't know enough about the brain. We don't know enough about things. And when we learn new things, we have to adapt our conscious thinking, how we think of those. So, Brian, I'm guessing you're 40 or early
40,
40s. And
42
I
this
would,
year.
okay, there you go. So that's how much I know about my fucking business partner and future CEO of the company. How stupid am I? But you know me, I don't like numbers. But think about this for a minute, Brian. Since you've been able to reckon, you know that there's a thing called the doomsday clock, or other people
Hmm.
call it different things.
Yeah, yeah.
And they move the numbers and they
Yep.
make a big show of it. So, we're 8 seconds to annihilation. We're 65 seconds to annihilation. We've never been more than a minute or minute and a half in 40 years that you've lived on the face of the planet. But you know what? The funny thing is, we're still here. Okay. 4 o'clock in the morning when I get up and head down to the gym, first thing that's on television is Match Game. And you know the jokes they were making on Match Game? They were making jokes about the price of groceries, how they're off the his, the price of fuel, how politicians are untrustworthy, and when a new broom sweeps clean, everybody on the other side. Look, Brian, certain things never change. And therefore, there's certain hardwiring that we have in our brains that is adaptable to current conditions. There's your
Yeah.
adaptive conscious. But what we do is we pick and choose. I read a LinkedIn article just yesterday, and the person was saying the thing that's going to save police work is changing how you teach cops to a Socratic method. No, no, you have to have a basis for a Socratic method. Okay,
Yeah, that's for
Socrates
yeah.
himself would have showed you how to do that. Now, I
Well,
agree 100% with.
Socrates
Yeah,
was an intellectual bully and also
yes, he
didn't
was.
believe in writing things down. So if you're writing down Socrates' quote, he would make fun of you.
He would laugh. It's so stupid. But the idea is that if you're telling me that you want semi Socratic, I'm in your corner. What's semi Socratic? Okay, so what do you mean by that? Well, how would that make somebody think? Well, what are other ways we would approach that? Brian, that's always been around. And we don't attribute that to Socrates. That's an intelligent mind is never bored and wants to learn more about things. So your intuitive mind is constantly thinking harmless things are harmful because it's a defense mechanism. It's a predisposition that all humans have. Okay. But we abandon that sometimes. And when we do, we fucking die. People
Yeah,
swim
yeah,
out to help
yeah,
their animal. I
yeah,
remember
yeah,
in Avon, the dog fell through the ice. They were playing with the frisbee. The guy went out and people drowned. People drown trying to save a dog. Now, Brian, that's so counterintuitive. And then somebody would say, "Well, I love my dog. I love my dog too."
yeah.
Okay, and my dog's laying right next to me. But you know what? If it's between she and I drowning, I'm not going with her. I mean, those are type of things that keep the species going. Procreation is another one. War is another one
Well,
because bad
that's the
ideas have to be punished somewhere, right?
well, and it's a different setting because you remember like you hear a Marine or someone jumps on a grenade when it gets thrown in the
Yep.
group. It's like, yeah, because they sacrifice themselves. It's like, but that's part of the training and initiation
Yep.
process you go through. It's like, no, you don't have to physically train to jump on a grenade. Like, hey, we're going to practice jumping on a grenade today. But the
Right.
idea is it's instilled to someone has to walk point, right? Someone
Yep.
has to do something. And so you'd rather take it all for the team rather than exposing everyone to that, right? But that's a process of sort of training and
Yep.
in a sense just
But it's
part of what it
society
is.
too. It,
But
it is
that's what I
so
mean. Like
ingrained because
you can
nobody can thrive alone. Nobody.
and you can
Nobody.
meaning there are examples of people overriding your basic need for survival for what though? For the survival of others or
For the
some
greater good of the team. You're spot on, Brian. Spot
and
on.
some of the stuff the big things and we get into this all the time because one of the big things in the article too is which is obvious we know and most people do is like storytelling versus data, right? Like
Yep.
nothing works better than a story is always powerful. And of course when they're going politicians are obviously they have to create a story or an image or a way to get things sticky. And so with this guy too is bashing certain ones like, well, but they all do that. That's
Yes.
part of capturing human
Again, you
attention
can't pick and choose because everyone has done
and
it.
and
Yes.
and storytelling is the oldest form of knowledge and skill transfer. That's how it
Exactly.
is. That's why it's so focused. So, but that's also why because humans implicitly understand stories, and I can relate to it. I don't understand statistics. No one does. Really good data
Right.
science and statisticians still don't have a full comprehension of it because it's so
Agreed.
counterintuitive to how humans think sometimes. So it's like, well, I can show you all the numbers, or I can just tell you this story, and that story will always be more
Yep.
popular. And that's where
Yep.
the urban legends come around. That's where everything. And so like you're when the thing about the politics one is like, yeah, but like you're not supposed to make policy off of stories. You're
Yep.
supposed to make it off of data and what will work best and looking at it, but that doesn't sell. So that's why you have to tie something to it. And so, but sometimes if they'll pick the wrong ones or use one that doesn't apply, but it doesn't, and once the narrative's out there, it doesn't matter anymore. But that's true. Like even why we try not to do the, hey, one of these days this is going to happen and you better hire us because we want, it's like, no, like stop.
Exactly. That
We
was
try
our
to
first principle, that we would never, ever
never,
use
not going to do the fear
fear-based
based. No,
advertisement.
no,
Ever.
because you don't need, because one, it works, yes, but it's also creates fucking more bullshit.
Yeah,
Where
yeah,
how
yeah.
many we're the ones that have to say opposite when people are like anything can happen. No, it fucking can't.
No,
Like, and when you said tell me
science
any
says it can't.
well,
Exactly.
Greg, like that's it goes right back into this. If you tell me that anything can happen when I walk out that door, I'm
Yep.
fucking terrified because that's really difficult. I can't
And
manage
my
everything.
my Rolodex is going to be spinning a mile a minute. So I'm never going to be able to land on a likelihood. I'm never going to be able to anticipate or see through the fog of war to go, there is a semblance of normalcy here. I just have to find it. If not, it's chaos. It's constant chaos. And you know what? You want your enemy to think like that. You want them to never understand what your move is. But if you're like that, Brian, that's unsustainable. And that means you're going to be a victim soon.
Yeah, no, and that's the whole thing is that's what leads to being overwhelmed, and now you're gonna fall
Absolutely.
back on obviously, what they call the harm bias or harm perception or
Yep.
vulnerability assumptions. There's some great terminology. You can call it whatever you want, but we're talking about
Right.
the same primal instincts. It's the same thing that you have, which allows immediate group cohesion. People
Yeah, yeah,
immediately
yeah.
band together or rip each other apart, and it's like it really is there. The the when if you're tying it back to evolution, if you're tying it back to the limbic system, you're generally going to be right. But what happens is then you meaning if that's really what's causing it or that's where it's coming from, if you're basing it off of these are autonomic human reactions, like you're probably
Yep.
heading in the right direction.
Yep.
But where I think these things go wrong, and there's plenty out there, is like when you try to make an overarching general like moral, judgment on someone, that's where things go wrong, right? That's why, like, if you look at even our first principles, and the first one being people the same all over the world.
All
Do we
over the world.
do we have differences? Well, yeah, of course. But if I go in general across time of all that humans being here, look, there are some basic things that humans need. And beyond that, it's kind of
Yep.
made up after that because everything else after that changes with time and with culture and with, advancements in technology. But there's some core elements here that affect every single human being and they affect us all the same way. So why don't we
Yep.
start there and then go from it? And then once you get
That's
into
it.
obviously, well, plus they're the different moral judgments. So like that's heavily influenced by different religions, by different cultures, by different traditions, right? So it's like, what are the core things? Well, everyone believes like, hey, the golden rule, right? Treat other people as you'd want to be treated. Like that's you're not going to go somewhere where they're like, no, treat people like shit until they
Shit on your
respect you.
neighbor
Like, you know
every
what I
day.
mean? It's like,
Exactly.
so, so,
Exactly. Even
so
North Korea doesn't do that. Come on.
yeah. So,
Sorry, North Koreans.
yeah. I don't know if we have a big
They're after
audience
me in
there.
Gunnison. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So
But
no, but look, you're right on. And uh, let's talk about a
yeah,
moral, ethical truth that's also in the behaviorist philosophy. Respect is easiest to build with harm-based storytelling. That's why when you see the downfall of a deadly attack or an explosion or a car wreck or anything else, it's much easier for me to sell you an airbag or a gun or a concealed holster or training. Okay. So we know that that's true. And then Gray cited the study from 2021 that showed that strangers who were offered anecdotes, stories, okay, it turned out they were much more willing to engage with the researchers than
yeah,
those that were offered data. And you
yeah,
said that people don't understand when they see the data, even if it's the best chart in the world. And the group that got the stories also treated their interlocutors with more respect. So what we're saying there is two truths, but
yeah,
is it fair? So, for example, the reason I mean is it fair to humans is that you're, again, putting your thumb on a scale. An injustice collector that's going to kill, okay, needs to control the narrative. you caused this. You made me do
Yeah.
this. You were the one that left me out. And look at what I endured. Same thing with the family annihilator. Same thing with the last 3 weeks, where each time a teen killed their entire family and then committed suicide. How do you think they rationalize that, Brian?
Yeah.
They look at what's going on in the media and on songs and in movies and all that other stuff, and they create a narrative. Now, whether that narrative is intertwined with reality doesn't matter, because it becomes a reality. And that's where you started the show.
Well,
It is so powerful to humans that you can write a false narrative, but your brain will believe it just as if it's a real thing.
and then
And
what
that's
you get,
dangerous.
well, this is the other, one of the significant parts about this and understanding, like, yeah, people are going, okay, yeah, I get it. It ties all back to, survival and fears. Like, yeah, but once you do that, now all of my actions are morally justified. I've now myself
Precisely.
taken moral, like, no, it's okay because this is evil. And so
Yep.
now it doesn't matter. And which is funny, which is why
They
I think
need
some
to
of
be
this is,
exterminated. They
well, this
need to
is,
be ostracized. Exactly.
which is actually why I think the military kind of discussions about this stuff are important, because they understand, no, that doesn't, like, just because these people are bad doesn't mean, just the ends don't justify the means. We can't kill everyone in the village because there's a
Right.
handful of bad guys in there. Like,
Yep.
I mean that's the whole thing. It's like, we can't be like them, otherwise we're just them if we do those same things. And then
Yep.
there is no more,
No
then
matter what
we're not
uniform you're
better.
wearing, no
Yeah.
matter what cause or banner that you're marching under, you're
Yeah, but
exactly right.
and that also too goes back to why I so focus on behaviors and what people actually do, not why they say, well, I did it because this. It's like, because it goes right back to the family annihilator thing. It's like, okay, like, maybe everything you said that was wrong was true. Maybe all of those things did happen. That
Yes,
doesn't mean that doesn't justify you killing those people,
precisely.
though. Like maybe your feelings are justified. Maybe what is
Agreed.
happening to you is unfair and bullshit. But, like, a lot of people have dealt with that and they didn't go kill their family. Like,
Yep.
I mean, you don't look into the sort of sympathy side of it from that person and go, oh, well, they had all these. Okay, well, are you going to address those issues in young kids then? Is that what you're getting out of this? Or are you just trying
Yep.
to justify their actions? Like, it's just this backwards way of looking at it, where they'll take into account some good things. Like, someone wants to go through and to say, I want to do, a forensic examination of that family annihilator kid. It's like, wow, look at all the issues they had growing up in this. And then
Yes.
they had a chemical
But you
imbalance, and
can't
then they had this.
conflate that,
But
because
that
we
but that
don't.
doesn't mean then, okay, well, we got to change how we do everything then.
Right.
It's like,
Right.
no, we can get better at identifying those people earlier on and saying, hey, this is someone that needs more help than everyone else. I'm all good with
Yep.
that. But then you can't come after the fact and then use that as some sort of justifying action or
Yep.
justifying, reason. It's not, like, I mean, that's the whole thing. Like, I I'm all good with the analysis and talking about it, but, like, how you use that is incorrect. Like, your
Yes.
application of this going forward is like,
Exactly.
you don't get to make these then statements. Like, just because I couple together some great reasoning
Yep.
doesn't mean my hypothesis or my solution is right.
That's
It
why
just
we talk about the scientific method. That's, look, there's a line that perfectly epitomizes what we're talking about. And Gray says that we have, it could be argued, been surprisingly good at muddling through modern times with the impulses we inherited from our troglodytic forefathers. First of
yeah,
all, what a great line. We
yeah.
use trogs all the time. We
Troglodyte,
use
yeah.
chuds all the time, right?
Hang
The
on real quick.
problem then, yeah,
Just remember Shelley. I go, what did you just call that person? And
exactly,
she walked over to the board and wrote troglodyte and the definition of it.
exactly.
She's like, and she goes, learn this. And I'm like, oh
Learn
my,
this early. Exactly. That was back in the T3, if you
yeah,
remember. Yeah.
yeah,
So, the essential, the most compelling claim of moral psychology is that people make ethical judgments on the basis of intuition rather than reason. Well, you can't say that because you threw the word ethical in there.
yes,
Okay. Because ethos does not apply to survival thinking. Because when you think of survival, the electrochemical neurotransmitters, your brain, the adrenal cortex, your limbic system, they override prefrontal cortex thinking, and all of a sudden you now exclude certain things that your body and your mind work together to say they're not as mission essential to my survival. And therefore saying that that's an ethical judgment, Brian, that's
right.
wrong, because it's not an ethical judgment. As a matter of fact, killing another human being is against all ethical judgments. But you know what? Sometimes we have to allow it. And sometimes people do it. And sometimes people do it for the wrong reasons. There are people that claim self-defense that are in prison now, right? And
Yeah.
because in their mind at that time, they made a selfish choice. I remember a caper that I did where a kid broke into a car. Kid, remember that kid. So, and I call a kid anything from 13 to 21. Kid broke into a car. Homeowner comes out. Car alarm starts going off. Kid runs from it. Homeowner starts gatting him down. Boom, boom, boom. Finally shoots him with the third shot. He's DOA. Okay. A DRT kid, because he was doing a property crime inside, and we arrested the homeowner because it was outside the curtilage of his property. It wasn't a self-defense situation. It wasn't any,
Yeah.
and the community and that guy shit on us. Now,
Yeah.
2 streets over, they go, that guy should spend the rest of his fucking life in jail, as
Yeah.
did the parents of the kid. Do you see what I'm trying to say? Brian, this
Yeah.
isn't a moral dilemma. It's not an ethical judgment. What it is that our instinct and intuition combined with our brain's survival chemistry is always going to choose what it thinks at that time and place is best for us. So therefore, if we skew the information coming in, if we change that and make
Right.
you irrationally fear something, then that'll lead to prejudice. That'll lead to bias, the bad kind. That'll lead to conscious and unconscious fear of things that we shouldn't be fearing. You know, and that'll malinger. That'll last a long time. It's like rust, never
Well,
sleeps.
and that's why, I mean, the law is already, it has, ethics and morals and values imprinted into it. That's what the law is, in
As
a
does the
sense.
Constitution and the Bill of Rights. You're
It's not
exactly right.
just about a legal. Well, the legal standard comes from our collective, societal judgments on things over time and
Yes,
how they've
yes,
changed, what they look at, and
and internationally, globally. You
yeah.
get
Well,
what I'm saying?
that's the thing
Have
is then
shaped our thinking.
someone goes,
You know,
"Hey, these guys are doing it here, and it's actually working really well." And they're like, "Oh, wow, okay." And then sometimes that can go wrong. It's like, "Well, we're not like that society at all. So you're comparing apples to oranges. So like
yep,
that won't work here." But like the theory behind it is sound, but maybe that's sound because they have a very homogenous group that they're working with, whereas
yep.
in the United States, it's
Which
complete
changes
chaos.
your view after a while too. Yeah.
But you brought up a good one, and you said that ethos doesn't apply to like a survival situation. I'm sort of paraphrasing, I think. I
Yeah,
was
yeah.
writing it down, but
But you're
but
close.
but in that, let's take that example right there, because the kid breaking into the car and then running away and then
Yep.
getting shot and killed, and people are like, well, you shouldn't be breaking the car. It's like, yeah, you're right, but but does he deserve to die for that?
There's
It's
nowhere on the
like
face of the planet
there's
that's a
no,
death sentence.
you know what I'm saying? I
Yep.
mean, what are we talking about here? Like, we don't do that anymore. We realize there's different, classifications of criminal activity and what's,
Yep.
where they fit in, and
Yep.
maybe it's unfair, but that's constantly changing. It's like, yeah, you don't have the right to do these things, and so but again, I agree that you can't. When someone's making judgments like that, yes, you can say their values as a person, their ethics plays into that, but that's shaped their perspective, but it's sort of detached from the specific decision. You get what I'm
Yes.
saying? In a sense,
Yes.
like they didn't say, well, because I was taught this way, and because my daddy taught me this, and because I went to this school and learned that, like, I'm going to make this decision. No, like the decision's been made, and then all of those
Exactly.
things maybe informed it at some level, but maybe not. I mean, because you see really bad people
Yep.
do good things sometimes. You see really good people do shitty things sometimes. So it's
Yep.
like you're, it's so contextually based in the moment with the individual circumstances. And everyone
Precisely.
talks about that. Oh, you have to take in the totality of the circumstances. But then they go, well, what about their ethics and morals? And it's like, well, does that even apply in the situation? Because this was something if it's fear based and it's survival based, it's going to be limited in capacity to what options your brain comes up with. Now,
Precisely.
maybe
Now
that
you're
more.
talking about a bias, though, Brian. Now you're spot on a bias, because things I don't know that influenced me when I was 11 years old in East Detroit come to play, and I don't even know they're coming to play. My fear of my uncle, and a situation and a smell and a sound that transports me back there, and now I'm feeling anxious and uncomfortable in a situation. Okay, I'll buy that. But that piece of a larger puzzle is going to be unpacked sometime later, not during the incident. During the incident, I'm going to do what it takes to get out of the incident.
Yeah.
And that's why we can't claim psychology or moral psychology or an ethical judgment in a spontaneous
Set of circumstances.
nanosecond
Yeah, yeah,
decision.
yeah.
You see what I'm saying? That's why we have to understand that biases can be both good and helpful, and they can be horrible and detrimental.
Well, and that's my point too. Is like when you have those discussions, and it's like, okay, given these set of circumstances, or what are your
Yep.
thoughts? Would you rather do this or that, or you have to choose between this? And it's like, okay, sitting here talking about it and discussing where that's one thing, but that's not how they play out in real life. And this part of the reason I found this interesting too is it leads right into how we look at solutions, whether it's a policy
Yeah.
decision, whether it's a training solution. Because some of the people will say, well, if you have a higher level of training and a higher level of experience, and you don't just know how to shoot, but you know how to fight, you know how to do this, you know how to do all that, and you're really proficient at this, and you've been through it, it's like, okay, I'm not saying that's bad. I'm saying that's all great. And yes, you're less likely to get overwhelmed. I would say as a general statement, right? The higher,
Yep.
more training experience you have, the less likely you are to become overwhelmed. So you have reduced
Exactly.
cognitive load, you make better decisions. However, unless you get to a certain point, unless you come in and it's everything is like, meaning that may not help you at all sometimes. So if we focus too much on just doing that, like you may still get yourself in a situation where that doesn't help. And if
Precisely.
it's a spontaneous, like, biologically primed response, you're going to fall back on fear. So whether or not you have the wherewithal or the training to handle the situation, it's always going to bias this outcome, or it's always
You're
going to
exactly
bias
right.
this way of looking at it in your perspective. And so it's putting things into, like, weighing things out when you look at all these different contributing factors, because everyone's like, okay, well, then it's morals and ethics. It's like, yeah, but that it
Is it?
can be like
Is
you
it
you
in a
you, you
thousand years,
know
if we look back, will that be the same answer? You touched on that earlier. In my
yeah,
argument, it's not. The gift of time and distance means more than just a survival in a firefight. It
yes,
means that you have to sometimes distance yourself from an argument and 360 it. You got to do the Hoberman. This is the point that we consistently try to get to these gosh damn trainers. Look, I remember the early days of the infantry immersive trainer, and you go in there and you get gunned down by guys in a hidden position, and the Marines walked out of there completely dejected. What did you learn? You learned that you got a simunition zipper stitch, on you, and that you lost half your squad leader, and you walked out all demoralized. And it was like, time out. What are we teaching people here?
yeah,
What are we doing? And so the idea is that your training, your understanding of an issue, your experience, all the things cumulatively that you do in your life, good and bad, are going to come to play consciously and unconsciously when you have to make those judgments. So the idea is the more file folders you have and the better weighted certain file folders are for logic, science, the better your decision making will likely be. So if your sense making is less flawed and if your problem solving has been tested, then you're likely to come to a better decision and be more resilient because you'll be more adaptive. And adaptive and adaptable are two words that I'll use interchangeably in
for
this
the yeah,
instant,
yeah, yeah,
in
yeah.
this instant, not in future instances. And so when you tell somebody after a scenario in a machine, or you add realistic smells, or you shoot a person and now they feel it in their leg, you really think that you're making a decision and what that person's going to pay it forward, but it's not. Because what's going to happen is that person is going to have that additional file folder, not a panacea. It's not a cure-all. So by doing that, you're going to have that, wow, I certainly don't want to get shot. I know I don't want to get stabbed, just like watching a video, just like getting punched in the nads when
Yeah.
you're younger, right? But that doesn't become a life philosophy. The brain is much more complex than that. So the brain is constantly looking out 5 and 25s for danger. And it's also looking at future danger. So when the elections were coming up, there's a certain half of America said Trump is the Antichrist. When he comes in, everything's going to
Yeah.
change. And the first couple of days, they were right because everything he did played into their narrative. The other people that are on the other side of the thing, oh, can't wait, got Biden out. This is going to be great. Guess what, Brian? They're
It
right
played to
too.
their yeah,
But
they're right
but
too.
you
Yeah.
can't be.
You can't
You
go yeah.
can't Okay, so what we got to do is we got to back off that ledge, give ourselves the gift of time and distance, and
Yeah.
say what
So
exactly is helpful. Because if we think what's helpful for us, for society, for humanity, those are the type of things. Those are
and
the type of good choices.
yeah, and the way, because you talk about the time and distance, and we talk about sort of information processing, and
Yep,
people like to say, we say too, like we're getting more information coming at us than we're typically used to, and it's not that we can't process a significant amount of information. I think it has more to do with just it's more things competing for our attention more than we
exactly.
recognize, right? So like our phones and computers and all that stuff. It's like because we've slowly adapted and started using it, it's like, well, it's actually taking a lot more of your attention than you realize. I
Yep,
think it's that because one of the things that they bring up, and people talk about this, and so do I, and where they say there's this sort of like mismatch between instinct and complexity. Like, okay, I have this
yep,
natural human instinct, but it's simple. It's like it's simple. It wants to it has a bias for simplicity, going, is this going to hurt me, kill me, can I eat it, whatever but if it's not that,
yep.
if I can bypass that part, then I can process like then it's my brain can understand this, right? You
Stages,
say like yeah,
exactly. That,
but because
modules.
it's a big one, and everyone talks about like when all this information comes out and then we find out this and see that proves this point, or someone did, and everyone tries to point to these different, especially when it comes to technology stuff, of like how it changed and social media changed this. It's like, okay, and I go back to everyone said, well, the invention of the printing press, that changed
Revolutionized. Yeah, yeah,
yeah,
of course.
revolutionized the world. It changed, actually had all these implications for the Catholic Church, because Martin Luther, that's when the Protestant Reformation happened, and he nailed his thesis, his problems with the Catholic Church at the door. And it's like, well, everyone's like, well, that kicked off all this because now all these people saw this. It's like, yeah, but when they saw that, they didn't go, "Oh my god, what is all this?" They went, "See, I fucking knew something was up. I had this feeling too." Meaning, like, it
Exactly.
wasn't a new revelation. It's just
Right,
someone had finally written it down, and everyone went, "Yeah, I fucking see
right.
that too."
And
So
there
it's
was
the same
probably
thing.
9 other Martin Luthers in different parts of the
Yeah,
world that were nailing their treatise on a door somewhere that
and
didn't get the press.
and that's what I'm saying is like, so when
Yeah,
these things like
I
that come
agree.
out and everyone, oh my God, now it's AI is the biggest thing. It's like, okay, well, like, did the internal combustion engine get rid of manufacturing? Did it get rid of this? Did it get rid of like every new machine that comes out? Did it get rid of it? No, it opened up an entire fucking economy and new things that no one had ever thought of before. But because
Right.
we always look at it as this impending, this big complex
Doom.
thing, it's
It's
like,
it's that clock again. Tick, tick, tick. This is it. This is the end of life as we know it. And Brian, you said something I want to make sure that our listeners are paying attention to. You talked about attention. Look, all of the information overload that is hitting our kids and hitting us and everything with your phone and the news and the music around you and all the stuff that's going on challenges our cognitive bandwidth, which means
yeah,
that we don't deep dive on critical issues. What we do is we skim because we
yeah.
want to get through all of it. Okay. You have to be careful about that, because what that does is that diminishes your capacity to discern what's essential and vital and what's just amusing and nominal. And if you don't do that, then everything is important, Brian, and everything is an emergency, and
Be,
everything is dangerous, you know?
because we have a very very wide but shallow amount of in terms of our knowledge base, right?
Yep,
For humans, it's very wide but it's very shallow. Like, we can know about all these different things but only at such a level of depth, right? Because there's not
yep,
enough time. Whereas like a machine or something can have a ton of depth, right? But it's very narrow, right? Yeah, it can give
exactly.
me the specifics and deep dive. So it's like this sort of way of looking at it, or our perspective. Our brain wants to simplify it for immediate understanding, but like there's so much more to it. And so if I just
So,
stick, like you're saying, if I just stick with this like immediate headline,
yes,
like, well, then I don't actually get the
it's
details.
making me dumber. So look, Max is 18 months
Yeah,
to
19
2 years,
months. Yeah.
and Mac will be 1 on February 1st. Okay, why is that important? Because if you look at the animal kingdom, a fucking giraffe lands on its feet when it's shit out, and it's still trying to
Yeah.
graze when there's a placenta. But with human kids, you would never take Max, push him
And
out
just
the
throw them
front door with
outside.
a
Yeah.
flashlight, and say, "Go." Okay? We have to understand that for everybody that wants to argue this claim of moral psychology and ethical judgment, you have to understand it takes us a long time. And a juvenile's brain is different, and a teen's brain is
Yeah.
growing. And so, what lessons, and those are back to our stories, Brian, what narrative do we want to follow? So, if we follow, people constantly are bashing religion, and it's always been that way because some people are going, religion's just screwing our
Yeah.
kids, or it's just taking our money, or it's doing this.
And now it's like swinging the other way
Yeah,
culturally sometimes. Like,
and what's
yeah.
happening is that religion gave us something to aspire to. Even agnostics said, well, maybe it's not God, but it's a
But it's
way of
something. Yeah.
living. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's a form. It's something. So I would rather have something than nothing, and no person can alone become anything. It's always a team. Nobody was born aware. Einstein was working at a patent office and he was working on great stuff. But guess what? He went to lunch with a friend. He discussed things with people.
Yeah.
He was writing stuff. So whenever we see these outliers, Brian, and Gladwell can eat me, but when we see these outliers, we constantly want to prop them up and we want to
Yeah.
say these people are special somehow. No, they become that, and I hate using the term because people have stolen it and used it for different. They become the lone wolf. And when you're that nail that sticks out, Gichin Funakoshi says, pound it down because it's not good for the tribe. It's not good for the team, and it's not good for society. So if your first reaction to buying Greenland is this is fucking ludicrous and this is the dumbest thing in the world and somebody should do that, then you're not giving yourself the gift of time and distance. Listen, if it's going to come up on your radar and create anxiety, you got to decide, is it worth it? Is the juice worth the squeeze? Is the cost benefit analysis good enough? If it has to do with your family and your livelihood and prices and costs and getting a job and stuff, then immerse yourself in it. But then and only then will you be making judgments on the base of reason rather than intuition. Because if not, you don't have reason because reason is earned and it's learned and it takes time. That's all I'm saying.
Yeah. Yeah. No. And you know, the historical precedent is always one of the best things to look at. I mean,
I agree.
like people say, yeah, that well, that's the newest thing. Well, not newest, but you know, when people are like, well, yeah, they all these people who like don't believe in God or don't thought religion was bad, but then they're like now picking up on this like, oh my God, this simulation theory, like this is all a simulation we're living in. This was built by, I was like, someone created like you're all
You
coming to the
mean
same collection.
exactly,
Like so
exactly.
there's some
But
higher
that's
order
reason.
here.
That's Brian. That's a balance of reason, and it has nothing to do with your instinct or intuition. That means the more we know, the more we can know, and that's an important distinction. That's why the police academy is more needs to be, in my personal opinion, needs to be more about problem solving and
Yeah.
sense making than it is about the decision. The decision will come. That's
Yeah, but
why
yeah,
we're
humans have
fighting the shoot don't shoot mentality
this
is because
that's
it's more about getting to the right decision and not making the right decision.
what no,
You
and that,
know,
that's a great point because that's what all these, you know, everyone's focusing on what the decision is, and it's like you haven't clearly articulated the problem. How are you already at a decision point?
precisely.
Like
Why do you
you
think
just
that we like reading case law? Because we like how people think, how
well,
they got to that point to
and
make those decisions.
and that's our approach when people are talking about, well, they gotta learn to make these decisions. I'm like, no, like humans actually know how to make decisions and they're
They
going
do
to
it
do
every
it.
day. They
They
do
can do
tens
it
of
in a
thousands of them.
logical manner. They can do
Yep.
it with empathy. They can do it with this. They don't have to learn that stuff. That stuff is a part of who we are in our DNA.
Yes.
What we
Yes.
suck at is the sense making and problem solving part
Yep.
because that's where all the things go wrong. That's where the fundamental attributions errors come in. That's where the
Yep.
cognition biases come in. That's where confirmation bias. It all comes in at this
Spot on.
initial point, and you're already talking about what to do. It's like, hang on, like you'll figure out what to do. Trust me,
Yep.
humans have because we're still alive, right? You'll figure out what to do if you're given the appropriate and correct set of fundamental assumptions, the
Yes.
appropriate and correct way of looking at things, and a general intended outcome that is good, right? If you go into every
Exactly.
situation like, yeah, I'm gonna fuck this up, like, okay, like, yeah, you're gonna, or let's go, like, hey, let's go fuck this dude up. It's like, yeah, well, that's what's gonna happen then. Like, but if you're
Brian,
going in with
both
the
of us have survived in different cultures, in different settings, in different lands, in different environments, meaning permissive, semi-permissive, non-permissive, without having a complete understanding of the language and the culture. And both of
Yeah.
us have. And so have tens of thousands, if
And
not by now, a
millions of people.
million,
Yeah.
okay, other people that have done that. And I'm not just talking warriors, I'm talking vacation, tourists,
Yeah.
teachers. You get what I'm trying to say? A lot of other people, kidnapped
High
victims. Okay.
school. I don't
Yeah.
know.
So the idea is the world is set up with us to be able to learn from our environment or be eaten by it. And this is right back to that original argument that Gray missed when he was looking at the overarching theory, because when we take a look at Dart's account, it was flawed, Brian. I'll agree with it, but his principles were correct.
Yeah.
What he was trying to say is, hey, this kid is really the town child, is really profound and prolific and important
And
to
here's
us.
why.
And what it
Yeah.
shows is he's the apex predator. No, wait a minute. When we dug a little deeper in the cave, we found out he was fucking lunch. But the
Yeah.
idea is that it was sound. So what we're talking about is reasonableness. We're talking about, like, for example, de-escalation. There was a video that I saw that somebody purported they were talking about training. And it was a Philippine hospital, if I'm right, emergency room, and a guy had a knife and was waving it around, and the security guard that appeared to be unarmed was kind of like, hey, relax, and sat down on the bench and crossed his feet and talked the guy out of the knife within a couple of feet of the guy. Okay? Not my style. That wouldn't have been the way that ended. And then a bunch of people, thousands of people, were going, oh, man, that guy was cool, calm, collected. You know what, Brian?
Yeah.
He might have been shitting his pants. We don't know that. He might have not known anything other to do. The other person might have said, hey, fuck it, it's not worth it. There's so many.
Or he had some other insight that he knew nothing bad was going to happen.
Exactly.
I mean, that's the whole thing.
Because this guy had done it every Wednesday at 2 o'clock for the last. So what we can't do is we can't point to somebody and say that's what we need to do. Because there's no time in your life or in your future that it's going to be exactly the same as that. That's why you got to train for sense making and problem solving to drive the decision, and that'll make you more adaptive and resilient. Because if not, then what you do is you're just adding file folders. Oh, okay. Now there's a new CPR. Oh, okay. Wait a minute. Now it's how many compressions? And Brian, when you get to that, you got OBE. You're going to be overwhelmed.
And that goes into, I mean, so much becomes based on, okay, this situation occurred. How do we never let this situation occur again? It's
again,
like, well,
exactly.
If you can't, you can't do that, but you don't need to. Like, you're never going to see that specific thing. Like, it goes back into, okay, you're going to make a policy, a new law, and you're going to base it off of this one case, or are we going to base it off of something more significant?
School shootings, perfect example.
Like, it's like, what are you trying to do here? Because there's other unintended consequences. There's going to be other second, third order effects that you're not accounting for. There always is. You can't account for everything.
Let's reinforce the glass, but the shooting takes place in a parking lot. Let's reinforce the door, but nobody has the keys to the lock. We're playing a game that you can't win.
You can't win.
And that's not sense making and problem solving. What that's doing is that's saying this is the problem, misidentifying the problem, and so we're going to throw all our money at that. School resource officer. There's your answer right there.
Or picking the one, and this goes back to even the political discussions too. It's like, or picking the one thing that I think was the biggest contributing factor and go, we just didn't have these, this wouldn't happen. It's like,
you got it. We can't get past that one thing.
Okay. Like well, it's just like a very, it's too simplified of a word, the way to look at things. You can't oversimplify things that much. That's not how it is. Like, you deal with all of these things beforehand and focus on how do I get better at understanding the world and the environment, what I'm in, because then once I know the rules of the game, right? Okay, now I get this. Now I see what's happening. Now I can make the most informed decision. And most people do. Like, that's the thing.
They do
like
every day.
Almost
every day. Most people make the right decision
even
on
with
everything
training,
they do.
No matter what it is, whether it's like any of our different clients, even if it's a private sector or law enforcement, military, it's like, okay, I'm going like, these people want to do the right thing. People want to make the right, they want to be right. We want to make the right decision. We want to do the right thing. So it's like, all right, how do we get better at that? Not, hey, maybe try this decision next time. It's like, no. They're already gonna go towards what's right if this initial part of understanding the situation is better.
That's
I
have
a bias. I have a bias for doing the right thing.
You have a bias for action, and the action will be sound because you followed a format. So when I talked about the elk being a vampire, it was a bitch slap of reality. And what I want to do is I want to shake people up so they think about it. So I'll give you one more brief one, Brian. I was unpacking some stuff for a kid in Iraq, a young Marine that was all bent out of shape because it was his door. He didn't boot it. The other person did and got lit up. And so I was like, walk me through what happened all that day. And they were like, well, we were going from clot to clot, going from courtyard to courtyard. And the first courtyard we found where it must have been 30, 40 people had shit and pissed in this one area that was behind this wall. And he said, then we went into the next courtyard, and you know what? We found a bunch of damaged ammo. Some didn't have primers, some were bent, and it was all piled up like they were throwing it away. And we went to the next place, and it was fruit and vegetables, and they were all damaged. It was all fetid stuff that had, worms and maggots in it and all that other stuff. And then we went to the next, and what he's doing, Brian, is he's laying out a sense making that he missed.
Yeah.
He never got to the problem solving stage to know that what he was following is the pre-attack phase where the unit that they were about to come up against that they didn't know was going to ambush him was going through and making sure all the ammo was ready and they were topped off and everybody had eaten and shit and was ready for the fight. And you know what, Brian? When we took him back through that road, when we said, look at all these things, he became one of the best instructors that you could ever think of because it was all about sense making and where's it got to lead? It's got to lead to the problem. What's the problem? Somebody's setting us up here, and you know what? Smelling it, seeing it, feeling it, tasting it gives me the gift of time and distance. That's all we're about. We're about, look, if you break these things down to their most base element, most of life is pretty gosh damn easy. And it's not anxiety producing, even though you're bent, you're forced into being that way because historically you were predated and eaten. And that's why I like the Tong Child example in Dart. And I think that we had a real good chance for Gray to make something profound, but his political biases caused damage that I don't think can be overcome.
Yeah, no, and then that's always it. It's like you're going from the other issue I have with any of these is like there's always some oversimplification or justification of
Yes.
some thing to fit
Of
their
a much
model.
bigger thing. Right.
And it goes, see, so this must be the solution. This is the reason why. It's like no, because you're on shaky legal ground, you're on shaky fucking scientific ground, you're on like you're just kind of like you're trying to come up with something, but like you know what I can use every single day is baseline plus anomaly equals decision. Because I can sit here and go, I can go, well, what's the baseline? Well, what's the baseline? What am I? And then now when I get really deep into that, then it's like, oh, okay, this situation is either a little bit more complex or a little bit less than I thought it was. I mean, that's the whole thing.
So
it's
I need more time and distance or I need less time and distance, right? Come on.
It's that, I mean,
I agree.
I don't know. We covered a lot and, I thought this was a good one for us to kind of discuss some of like the philosophical and moral and ethical things and how that plays in and how it may inform, but the individual person, most people can't sit here and articulate. It's like when people get all into these manifestos that someone writes, it's like they're all over the place. They're fucking nonsense. You know why? Because they're a fucking confused individual.
Exactly.
And they have no,
any clear answers.
They're stringing things together because it sounded good to them. Like, someone who loves posting motivational quotes. It's the same thing, but it's a manifesto and it's not motivational. It's really bad stuff. You know what I mean?
But then if you took them back and said, you know where that comes from? Who the other? No, they don't. So they're not making a rational or reasonable or a logical decision.
We're attributing values to influences that likely had less of an influence than people think. Is what my big point is on all of these. And with any type of moral debate stuff, it's like you can have a nuanced discussion about a situation, but you can't reflect philosophically when you're in the middle of something. You can't reflect on what you can't even like
not the time either.
Yeah. Well, even if like, that's why it's like, you can't reflect. Like, what's the purpose of doing an after action on something? It's like, well, you can't reflect even during training. I can't reflect on what I'm doing while I'm doing it. I'm doing
What's
it.
court
so
for?
Then I can go back.
Court is for the judge and the jury and the evidence and stuff. And Brian, sometimes for an incident that took nanoseconds, it's months and months of preparation. And then the trial lasts weeks, if not months. Come on. That's what that is. That's exactly what you're talking about. That's life's after action review.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. Well, we covered a lot, and kind of got our thoughts out there on this as best as I guess I could. But but again, it reinforces like this is great, this is interesting. I love seeing why people do certain things.
Agreed.
But I'm just more concerned about like what did they actually do, not what they said or why they said they did it. It's like, just look at the actual thing that was done. What were the behaviors
Behavior
that were done?
over theory.
Yeah,
Exactly.
and like that's who the person is. It's like what that's it. It's not what they say, it's not what they think, it's not what they feel, it's what they actually do. And so because though there could be misalignment on all of those things,
Yes.
but cognitively with individuals. But we'll I think we'll do some extra stuff for the Patreon folks.
Cool.
If you want to, yeah, the Patreon listeners, I think we'll give some. We've got some good little, I guess, little, I don't know what you call them, limited objective experiments, little simple tasks you can try out in the moment or when you're hearing stuff or you're looking at stuff, and we'll give some kind of exercises for our Patreon folks to do to kind of
I'm excited about that.
reinforce what we're talking about. I
I
guess.
can't wait to hear what they might be.
Yeah. All right. All right, everyone. We appreciate you guys tuning in. If you
We
like
do.
the show, please share it with a friend. That's the best way to get it out there. And then reach out to us, of course. And we've got a ton more on our Patreon. So if you have any questions, I'll hop on and answer there. But we appreciate everyone. And we've been super busy and got a lot going on. So we're going to be more consistent here as we go forward. But just got a lot happening right now. But thanks, everyone, for tuning in. And don't forget that training changes behavior. So